Sometimes I wish people didn't listen quite that carefully.
Camera's pointing this way.
No, that's fine. I like the interaction. It makes it easier for me.
Here it is, Isaiah 12.
What about the woman who used to have the position you have now in the class? She recruited people to teach. Can't think of her name.
Talking about Carolyn.
Yeah, Carolyn. Carolyn. Yeah. Oh. Oh.
Sold their house here, kids have grown with Google and major. So they went out to live
Like San Francisco.
Yeah.
Because I think kids got big internet.
Oh. Oh. Okay.
Around.
Do you reset it?
Yeah, I don't know. I went and reset the little box, little converter box in the back. Hopefully that fixes that fuzzy sound.
Organized this, the agenda.
Mm.
We went to Monticello yesterday with Charlotte's mom. She came up, and
Is your mom in South Carolina?
her mom lives in Charlotte.
No, no, I was just
Her mom and dad
thinking
live down there. But she comes up like
when
twice a
she
year.
and I interacted off and on.
She'll be here till Tuesday.
But
They're coming to the service this morning
Oh, nice.
to hear Jason's voice.
Carolyn, she has a daughter that nobody knows about.
Shirley, everyone.
She and I were in grad school. We weren't in any of the same classes, but I used to see her in the hall in Sanger Hall. And then I actually met her in church like 30 years ago. But she hadn't changed a bit. I mean, she has the same hair, everything, exactly the same.
I remember the year I had an appendicitis and I'd taught two of these classes. And as I was, they were pulling me away from Scott to take me down the hall. Call Carolyn, got me. Send her an email to tell her I can't be there on Sunday.
So 11 today. Since we were
It was
wondering.
great.
Okay, welcome everyone on this beautiful Palm Sunday morning. Beautiful
is
but
Palm?
chilly. What are you supposed to say? Happy Palm Sunday, Merry Palm Sunday, or what's the proper? I mean, it's Happy New Year and Merry Christmas. What do we do on Palm Sunday? I don't know. Anyway, huh? Blessed.
Oh, that's a good one.
Blessed Palm Sunday to everyone. Thank you all for joining. Can I get a thumbs up on Zoom that you can hear me? There you go. Thank you all. Glad to have you with us on Zoom. Rebecca Weaver is with us again today to lead us in a discussion on Easter in early Christianity. Rebecca is Professor Emerita, not Emeritus, right? Emerita of Church History at Union Presbyterian Seminary. And this will be her last Sunday with us. And we want to thank you, Rebecca, for your flexible schedule, given Safwat Marzouk had some conflicts. But Safwat will be back with us on the 24th. But thank you for your flexibility, Rebecca. Thanks to all who attended the Nehemiah Action on Tuesday. It was well attended. I went in person down to the convention center, and there were a lot of people there. It was kind of surprising given the weather and all, but it was very well attended. I hope those of you who couldn't come were able to log in via Zoom. Also, thanks to all of you who donated to the Nicaraguan Student Scholarship Fund for the Central Moravian Church. Our goal was to raise $300, and we actually raised 600 plus. So we were able to sponsor 2 scholarships, plus a little money I think will be given to the reserve fund there as well. Also, one other announcement I saw in the First News Weekly that might be of interest to people was Rework Richmond is looking for anybody who has an extra vehicle on their hands that they would like to donate to the cause. So Rework provides help to those looking for job assistance, and one of those areas they try to help people with is transportation to work. So they are looking, if you have an extra vehicle they'd like to donate to the cause, you can look up the information on First News Weekly and go there. For those of you on Zoom, please remember to keep your mic muted unless you are talking. If you'd like to ask a question, please put it in the chat function or raise your hand so we can recognize you. And those of you who are here in the room, if you have a question, please raise your hand so we can pass you the mic so that everybody can hear you on Zoom for your questions. So, all righty, with that, Rebecca, welcome.
Thank
And
you.
thanks for being here. Looking forward to the discussion.
It's good to be back 2 weeks early. As always, let me know if you cannot hear me. I do mumble at times, and please feel free to interrupt me. I really enjoy the questions and appreciate them. There were a couple of issues that were raised last week, one during class and one to Mary D afterwards, and I'd like to work with those. Actually, what Mary D first invited me to do here is to talk about the practices of the church for early Christians with regard to Easter. Could we do that next year? Last week, in trying to give some background and look at the gospel and Paul with regard to the resurrection, I realized that this topic is huge, and so we're just going to stay with what we were doing last week, if that's okay. The first question was about the difference between the way the risen Lord was presented in non-canonical documents from canonical documents. The canonical documents are the 4 Gospels in the New Testament canon. The non-canonical Gospels are, the literature is what didn't make it into the New Testament. And these documents are referred to as apocryphal, which means hidden, but they never were hidden. They just didn't make it into the canon. They circulated widely, and people felt free to amend them, to add to them, to do whatever they wanted with them. So they don't have quite the same static form that the canonical documents do. They come in the form not only of Gospels, but Acts of the Apostles, epistles, and like as in Paul's epistles, and apocalypses. And that is, they came in the same form as other New Testament writings. They were mostly written in the 2nd and 3rd century, but didn't necessarily get a final form then. They seem to have been composed, frankly, as pious fiction. Let's fill in the detail, what was Jesus like as a little boy? I think we talked about that one time when I was here, and I read some of those accounts about, imagine a 3-year-old boy who was omnipotent. It's terrifying. Same with a 3-year-old girl. I'm not being sexist, or really with anybody. It's terrifying. But we get a lot of information about Mary and her very pious, very pure childhood, and her feet not even being allowed to touch the floor. And how her parents took her to the temple and left her there to be reared in the temple. But as she became a young woman, the those in the temple realized she needed to be married. And so Joseph was chosen pretty much by lot. And Joseph conveniently was an old man, and he was embarrassed. He said, well, everybody will think I'm a fool to take this young woman as my wife. But they convinced him that that he would be, that he was the one that God wanted. But they get elaborate like that. I mean, it's just trying to fill in the gaps. They often deal with marginal figures, such as the woman with the issue of blood who was healed by Jesus when she touched the fringes of his garment. She also was conflated to the woman who, as he was walking, carrying the cross and fell, she offered a cloth and wiped his face, and was given a name, Bernice, which in Latin is Veronica. So you may have heard about Veronica along the way. I mean, these are wonderful tales. And Mary Magdalene is an interesting figure in all this, because there's so many Marys in these accounts, and there's Mary, the mother of Jesus, but Mary Magdalene and Mary of Bethany. So Mary, and then there's the woman who had however many demons. And so she was thought to be a prostitute. And Mary Magdalene pretty much became all these characters, so that around the year 600, Gregory the Great, Gregory the First, who was Bishop of Rome and thus Pope, he just declared that these people are Mary Magdalene. He just put all these figures together. And so that's the way she's known there, where there isn't any connection in the New Testament to Mary Magdalene being all these other women as well. One of these, but there are also documents that are not pious fiction so much as attempts to undermine what were often considered to be the Jewish elements of Scripture. And the Jewish elements would be anything that connected Jesus with the God of creation. He couldn't have come from the God of creation, because the God of creation is the God of the Old Testament who created matter. And they didn't want the great high God to be involved in any way with the creation. He couldn't have been prophesied, because the prophets have to do with the God of the Old Testament, the God who created matter. So Jesus must have come from another God, the high God, the spiritual God, and that he himself was entirely spiritual. He only appeared to do things like eat and sleep. And he couldn't have, as spirit, he could not have suffered on the cross. So some wouldn't even have a cross scene or any crucifixion scene. But others would say there was somebody else up on that cross, or it just looked like he was there suffering, but he really wasn't. So you get a mix of things in these non-canonical documents, and any one of them you look at, you can kind of figure out why they were not included. A main reason they weren't included was they weren't written until at least the 2nd century, and they couldn't be connected with any of the apostles. Now, one of these, the Gospel of Peter, attempts an account of the resurrection. We noticed last week there aren't any accounts of the resurrection itself. No accounts in the Gospels or anywhere in the New Testament, but the Gospel of Peter tries to provide one. This is a book that has the apocryphal Gospels. There's another volume too that is considerably larger, and it has all the extra epistles and all the non-canonical acts of the apostles and epistles and apocalypses. These are just Gospels. Some of them come in fragments, and some of them are the complete text. But let me read this to you. Now, I'm starting in the middle. Now, in the night in which the Lord's day dawned, which would be the first day of the week, Sunday, the day of the resurrection, when the soldiers, 2 by 2 in every watch, were keeping guard, there rang out a loud voice in heaven, and they saw the heavens opened, and two men came down from there in a great brightness, and they drew near to the sepulchre. And the stone which had been laid against the entrance to the sepulchre started of itself to roll and gave way to the side. And the sepulchre was opened, and both the young men entered in. When now those soldiers saw this, they awakened the centurion and the elders, for they were also there to assist in the watch. And while they were relating what they'd seen, they saw again three men come out from the sepulchre, and two of them sustaining the other, and a cross following them, and the heads of the two reaching to heaven, but that of him who was led of them by the hand, overpassing the heavens. So there's a third figure being held up by the other two, and the two helpers, their heads reach to heaven. The person who's being assisted, Jesus, his head goes beyond the heavens. And they heard a voice out of the heavens crying, "Thou hast preached to them that sleep." And from the cross there was heard the answer, "Yes." And those men therefore took counsel with one another to go and to report this to Pilate. This is the closest thing we get to an account of the resurrection. It isn't written until at least the 2nd century. It seems to have circulated widely during that time, but then gets lost and isn't rediscovered until the late 19th century. And we just have fragments of it. But they're trying to answer the question, what did the resurrection look like? And I can appreciate the Gospels to being so circumspect. They didn't have a cross that talked to them. They don't have angels coming down and helping Jesus out of the tomb, and Jesus' head goes beyond the heavens. This is just somebody's pious imagination. Any reactions, any comments? Yeah.
I think the accounts that we have in the
Yes.
they were surprised. They didn't expect it.
Right.
Taken off guard.
Right. But they do have guards here, and that's important. Guards who saw all this. So what we have are a bunch of witnesses, even more than we had before. So that is the only account we have from anybody about what the resurrection looked like. But what about the appearances of Jesus? One of the curious things about the appearances is that once you get to the apocryphal Gospels and Acts and so, you don't have those appearances. They don't seem interested in the appearances. You would think there are all sorts of things you could invent about Jesus's appearance, but after he has risen, but they don't express much interest. However, in the Gospel of Nicodemus, it is the Joseph of Arimathea is being questioned, and he has gotten in trouble with the Jewish authorities because he wanted to take care of Jesus' body and deal with it decently, and so he wrapped it in linen and put it in his own tomb. And then the tomb was for 3 days. Jesus was in the tomb 3 days, but Joseph of Arimathea was locked in his own house. The authorities made him stay in his own house, locked in for 5 days. And then Jesus, who is now resurrected, comes to see Joseph of Arimathea in his house where he's locked up. And Joseph said, on the day of preparation, about the 10th hour, you shut me in, and I remained the whole Sabbath. And at midnight, as I stood and prayed, the house where you shut me in was raised up by the four corners. And I saw as it were a lightning flash in my eyes. Full of fear, I fell to the ground, and someone took me by the hand and raised me up from the place where I had fallen. And something moist like water flowed from my head to my feet, and the smell of fragrant oil reached my nostrils. And he wiped my face and kissed me and said to me, do not fear, Joseph. Open your eyes and see who it is who speaks with you. I looked up and saw Jesus. Trembling, I thought it was a phantom. And then I said the 10 commandments, and he said them with me. Now, as you well know, a phantom immediately flees if it meets anyone and hears the commandments. And when I saw that he said them with me, I said to him, Rabbi Elijah. And he replied, I am not Elijah. And I said to him, who are you, Lord? And he replied, I am Jesus, whose body you asked for from Pilate, whom you clothed in clean linen, on whose face you placed a cloth, and whom you placed in your new cave. And you rolled a great stone to the door of the cave. And I asked him who spoke to me, show me the place where I laid you. And he took me and showed me the place where I laid him. And the linen cloth lay there, and the cloth that was on his face. Then I recognized that it was Jesus. And he took me by the hand and placed me in the middle of my house with the door shut, and led me to my bed and said to me, peace be with you. Then he kissed me and said to me, do not go out of your house for 40 days. For see, I go to my brethren in Galilee. Any reactions to that? As one of the appearance stories, compare them with the women who saw Jesus. Mary in the garden saw Jesus, thought he was a gardener at first, confused about who he was, but then he called her by name and she recognized him. But he said, don't hold on to me. And further in the Gospel of John, where Jesus appears in a locked room where the disciples are. And they see the wounds. He shows them his wounds, tells them to touch him. He eats with them. He's trying to show he is a body. He's identifiable to them, and they were scared to death, but they rejoiced. And in their joy, they still didn't believe. That's Gospel of John. Mark has nothing, and Matthew has the women seeing Jesus, but there's no, and the women go and tell the disciples, and the disciples don't believe them. Peter runs to the grave and sees it's empty. But then somehow the disciples all meet in Galilee, and that is where Jesus gives them the Great Commission. You had a question?
This is a little off the path, but I wondered if in these other accounts, if there are any that where Jesus visits his mother.
Visits his mother? I am not aware of that, but that doesn't mean it's not there. There's an awful lot of apocryphal literature that I just don't know that. I wouldn't be surprised. There are a couple of books on Mary. Sorry, anything else? Any reaction to the differences between this and what you saw in the canonical gospel? Yeah.
There's a lot more dialogue with Jesus or of Jesus speaking to Joseph.
I'm sorry, I
A
can't hear
lot
you.
more dialogue, a lot
Oh,
more
yes.
speaking in this one
Right.
you just read.
Right,
And it's curious, and I don't know what the reason is for this, but they, in the reciting of the Ten Commandments, that
Right.
was an interesting
Right.
part of that too.
right. That was, so if you get somebody who'll recite the 10 Commandments with you, then you know at least it has to be a human being. And probably a good human being. Bad ones wouldn't want to acknowledge the commandments. But a phantom isn't gonna, a phantom would simply flee.
And one other thing is the Joseph of Arimathea was in first person rather than third, as much
Right.
of the rest was. in third
Right.
person.
Yeah, I,
So
Joseph,
it's
said
sort of
such a.
shocking.
Right, yes. Right, and that's, you're right, that is not in any of them, any of the canonical gospels. But it leaves a lot of room. I mean, I don't think this, well, I don't think either of what I've read to you, either of these documents is in any way trying to undermine the canonical gospels or what was generally believed about Jesus and the resurrection. They were just adding to it. Let's just imagine what happened to Joseph of Arimathea. I mean, he did something very important. What do you think he was like? How did the authorities, Jewish authorities, respond to him and what he'd done? Were they mistrustful?
A little bit.
Sure. I mean, I think it's just ask questions and then let's try to imagine. And that, I mean, we do that all the time in Bible studies, try to get yourself into the skin of somebody. What was it like to be the person Jesus healed? What was it like to be an onlooker?
I wonder, well, I don't wonder. I think we can assume that the motivations of these writers were to feed his sheep,
Yeah, yeah,
something new and different maybe,
right.
and to help me embrace that type of feeding. I looked to the modern world where this Douglas wrote this book in 1942. I just looked it up, called The Robe,
Oh, yeah, Lloyd C. Douglas, yeah.
and converted to a movie. I was a young guy. It was a moving story. It was an inspiring story. 100% fiction, I imagine. But it motivated me to want to know more and to know the difference between the fiction and the real. And
Yeah,
so
yeah.
there was a chance where pure fiction meant a lot. Several years ago, in one of our classes, we were putting together a little book session where we'd share books with each other. And
Mhm.
we made a list of books to share and we were passing it around. Someone mentioned Anne Rice, the vampire killer lady,
Yes.
who obviously is demonic. And why we'd want to read her, I didn't know. And so I bought my first Anne Rice book, and she did a tremendous amount of research. She sourced 55 books of history, culture, the law. She studied the land
Mhm.
and the people. And so when she wrote and she made up things, experiences in Christ's life, a young lady who was interested in him, things that are titillating and
Yeah, sure.
interesting, that certainly there must have been some woman he looked at somewhere, like how would he react to that? And she brought details forward on how they lived, where they lived, how many people lived in the house. They were cultural history that helped me fill in as she fictionalized the story of his life.
Mhm.
And filled in a lot of interesting things that were coincidences that we'd never imagined could have happened in the Bible. So it's fun, but I like knowing when it's real and when it's not.
I think we can trust that these non-canonical gospels and the apocryphal literature tell us a great deal about the piety of people, the piety of Christians, and the practices of Christians during, not in the first century, but later. And this tells us what, I mean, where in the proto-evangelium of James, all about, I mean, Mary, we've really got a lot of information about Mary, which tells us about the piety toward the mother of Jesus, but in the second and third century, but it also has shaped piety. I mean, there's nothing in the New Testament to suggest the perpetual virginity of Mary. It's not even clear that she never had conjugal relations with Joseph, but that offends a lot of people. And so these things tell us about what people in the second and third centuries were thinking about Mary, and the fact that they're so well known and influenced a lot of piety and continue to over the centuries tell us that they're hooking up with something. They touched a nerve there. I mean, yes.
There's a newer book out about Jesus' life by Sue Monk Kidd, I
Yes,
think is the
yes.
author. I can't think of the name of the book, but it's
The
in my
Book of
bookshelf.
Longings.
Longings, that's
Yeah.
it. And in this book, Jesus marries and has a child that dies, but you know, he experienced it. It's just very interesting about his life, and to think of him in relationship with a wife,
Right.
child, and you know,
It fills up the years from the time he's about 20 until 30.
Yeah.
So you have a decade there. What was his life like?
he had to go to work.
Sure, he had to go to work.
He had a wife and he went to work doing
Right.
different things
Right.
at
He
different times.
seems to have been a handyman of sorts.
Yes.
But he was a stone cutter, but he was also a carpenter. I mean, and he traveled to support, because he was trying to support his mother, and then there was sort of a clan developing there in his mother's home.
I
I
have
think
it
it's
if anybody
it's-
wants to read it.
How are these apocryphal writings used in the Catholic Church? Are any of them continuing in their in the practices of the Catholic Church?
Well, I think with Catholics and Orthodox,
Mhm.
particularly what I spoke of, the proto-gospel of James, where it talks so much about Jesus' not Jesus' childhood, about Mary's childhood, gives names to her parents, and what a pure young girl she was growing up to assure her virginity. And then Joseph is chosen by Lot. That seems the will of God. He just is conveniently a man who is long past his prime. And so then he continues in this to preserve her virginity. Those have stories like that have influenced the notion of the perpetual virginity of Mary. And you see that in both Catholic and Orthodox. So we have some doctrines that were at least shaped by that. I mean, they have other things they consider about this, but and how they read the New Testament. But yeah, I mean, and there are a lot, and all the animals in the stable and so forth when he was born. There's a lot of that. But then there are a lot of things that are like Nicodemus, the Gospel of Nicodemus talking about Joseph of Arimathea. No, they're not using that. Anything else? Okay, well, let's go on then to the second issue that was raised, which apparently someone was concerned about looking at the four Gospels, the resurrection appearances, And we see that Mark doesn't have anything. Matthew, Luke, John, John, and Acts do have information, but what they tell us, it's not the same. It's different in Matthew from the way it is in Luke, from the way it is in John, and then Acts. Luke and Acts and Matthew have an ascension account, but they do differ. So does that undermine the integrity of what we say we believe, that Jesus was raised from the dead? It doesn't hurt it in any way for me, and maybe it's just my temperament and my values, but these differences, I don't think, undermine either the gospel message or what we say in the creed. Remember, in the Apostles' Creed, we say, I believe in the Holy Spirit, the Holy Catholic Church, communion of saints, communion of saints, resurrection of the body, and the life everlasting. We affirm that, and the creeds are seen as a lens for interpreting scripture. I don't have any difficulty with that. I don't pretend I understand what it means to say the resurrection of the body, but I am willing to be taught by the church what it means. A fellow who taught me New Testament at Austin Presbyterian Seminary a long time ago, his name was John Jansen, and he wrote a book called The Resurrection of Jesus Christ in New Testament Theology. And I'd like to give a quote from him. The New Testament portrays the resurrection of Jesus as a many-splendored thing, so that its united witness to the centrality of Easter is not a uniform witness, but one that embraces a rich diversity of expression. Easter's central, but the ways that the New Testament talks about it, it's so big, it allows for a lot of attempts to explain it. I find that enlarges my understanding. Anything that pushes me so that my thinking about God gets bigger, larger, less pedantic, anything like that enriches my faith. I know that is not true for everybody. But I believe I tried to say last week, there's a reason there are 4 gospels. And that they all say the gospel according to somebody. It's not the whole thing in Mark or Matthew or Luke or John, but they each have, they have similarities, but they each have their own way to approach it. Luke is writing on the whole to, or more than likely to Gentiles. And he carries the message from the Gospel of Luke to the Acts of the Apostles. It's the same author, and he's showing it how it spreads in the church. And you see even different interpretations. We see Peter preaching at Pentecost to Jews, but we also see Peter preaching to Cornelius, the Gentile. I think it's in Acts 10. The emphases are somewhat different. But they're all trying to point at the same thing and recognize that this is an act of love by the infinite God, and our finite minds can't grasp it in its totality. Yeah.
So it didn't really, for me, it didn't really reach cognitive level until last week that all these gospels are writing after Paul, I mean, which you brought up.
Yeah.
And so you said, I think you said, we don't know whether they were writing through the lens of having read Paul's writings already, or whether they, just chronologically they came later, but I thought that was interesting. So we have to reconcile not only the Gospels among themselves, but also with what an earlier writer says. Well,
Yeah, and Paul does speak at times in ways that might suggest he is not, well, he says he's no longer interested in Christ after the flesh. But and a lot of people took that as meaning that we need to get back to what Jesus was like walking the earth. And so the Gospels are, especially Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they really have a man who's walking that area with other men and some women who were helping support the group. We see a human being walking there. I think if we didn't have the Gospel of John, it would never occur to us that Jesus was anything other than human. But when you read the three synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, through the lens of God, through the lens of John, then this one is somehow not just a human being, but something else. John begins, as you know, with saying, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then a few lines later, and he came to us, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, full of grace and truth. So we have three Gospels that are where his humanity is abundantly clear. And then John, which has both humanity and deity. And I think in the synoptic Gospels, you have one you have his humanity as standing out, but there's also a sense there's something else going on with him. But they weren't trying to claim that he was the eternal Son of God in the way that John was. Yes.
There are a number of miracles in all the Gospels.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Miracles often occur where people are raised from the dead and something happened like that.
I'm not the best person to ask about miracles. Something happened. I don't know what it was. Lazarus did come out of the tomb. People were healed. Jesus clearly was an exorcist. I think he was a faith healer too. And I think that's one reason so many people were attracted to him. I mean, he did the kinds of things we count on God to do, heal us. And certainly it was long before the days of modern medicine. I don't think it's the skepticism we have towards such things would not be the approach they have. Is that okay? I think we just by nature are skeptical. And so it gives us something, we have to get past that. But I think we get past that when we look at the kinds of things Jesus did, they're always for people's good. Healing, feeding, casting out demons, they're always for people's good. How he did that, I don't know.
Being Son of God.
Well, yeah, sure, then that comes in. But that doesn't mean there weren't other healers at the time or other exorcists at the time. So yes, that can be used later and is used later as a pointer to his deity. But there were others who were doing some of the same things. If you remember in Acts, I've forgotten the fellow's name, but he, I think it was Simon, and he wanted to buy the power from the apostles. And because it was mad. He thought it was all magic, because the apostles continue this, the healings. Anything else? Jansen has helped me. I don't, what time? Is it time? 5 minutes? Okay. Jansen has helped me to look at the resurrection as an event that is anchored in the past. It points toward the future, but we have to live it out in the present. And the anchor in history, and when you think about those gospels, they are really careful to anchor the resurrection, the crucifixion and resurrection in time and space. The crucifixion and resurrection took place in Jerusalem, a place, during Passover, a time, when Pilate was governor, a time. The event occurred over 3 days. Day 1, Friday, before the sun went down, he had died and had been buried, because they couldn't do anything like that on the Sabbath. And the Sabbath would begin. The Sabbath would begin in the evening of Friday. Saturday starts about 6 o'clock, what we would still call Friday. And so we get into the second day, the Sabbath, when nobody did anything. And then the third day begins Saturday, what we would call Saturday night, and goes throughout the night into what we would call Sunday. That's the third day. It's the third day. It also happens to be the first day of the week, which comes to be called the Lord's Day. Did I get my 1, 2, 3s and my 3, 2, 1s? But they're trying to anchor it in time. This happens in 3 days in this place. And Jesus, although no one sees what's happened in the tomb, there is an empty tomb, which the women find. Peter also sees, and the beloved disciple. But Jesus appears in Jerusalem, Galilee, Emmaus, the road to Damascus. And Paul says to 500 people. The descriptions have a concrete character to indicate something actually happened to Jesus. For a while, the idea was that the resurrection was this rise of faith in the believer. It was a subjective experience. And the subjective experience is important, the subjective appropriation. But Jansen is trying to argue that it's actually an objective event. It's what happened to Jesus that's important, not how we feel about it. And the appearances make clear that there's something different about Jesus, but he's still recognized as an individual. Maybe not immediately, but he allows himself to be recognized. When Mary in the garden doesn't know who he is, then he calls her by name and she recognizes him. The disciples are scared to death when he enters into that room where they're locked in. They think he's a ghost, but they also know it's Jesus, and they see the wounds in his side. I think perhaps the most important thing to say, and it has to do with the question from last week, is the resurrected body is not like a resuscitated body. For example, the resuscitated body of Lazarus. Lazarus had to die again. He was resuscitated for a time, but he had to die again. Jesus has what Paul will talk about as the glorified body. And I think this is where Paul comes in. It's a glorified body. It's still identifiable as Jesus, but it's different somehow, and it will not die. And that's what, in that our hope is grounded. And Arnold, dear, you ask about the ascension. And of course, I've been thinking about it ever since. To me, the ascension is a way of saying that Jesus is not available to us now in the way that he was to the disciples before the crucifixion. I'm not saying he's unavailable. He is available to us through the work of the Spirit, through communion, the Lord's Supper. But we live in hope for what will be. In 1 John 3:2, the content of the hope, and this is the verse, it does not yet appear what we shall be, but we know that when he appears, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. The ascension tells us, well, if you remember in the first chapter of Acts, Jesus is around for 40 days showing himself so they'll know he's alive and that it is Jesus. But then he takes them outside of Jerusalem, and he is, before he ascends, one of the disciples says, well, now are you going to tell us when you're going to set up your kingdom? When you're going to overcome Rome? I mean, we know now you've been resurrected. Everything's different. So when are you going to set up the kingdom we've been waiting for? And Jesus says, I'm leaving. You're the ones who have to stay here. And you're the ones who have to tell this story. And you're to do it to the ends of the earth. And that is where we live after the ascension. And it's a different place from where the disciples were before the crucifixion and resurrection. But it's much more like where they were after the ascension. We're stuck here, and it's hard, but we've still got to be living out that resurrection faith. Any questions? If I have distressed anyone, please tell Mary D. And she will answer. She will, no, if I can be of help, I'd be glad to, but because it is not, it's my intent to build up, not to tear down. So anyway, thank you.
Yes. I can assure you, you always build us up.
Thank you.
Rebecca, thank you so
Thank
much for
you.
joining us and talking about such a very interesting subject, particularly this time of year. So I understand there's some beautiful music in store for us at worship. So let's all ascend to the worship service.